Well, little did you guys know we would be on day 3 of our snow break, and I am going to go ahead and record and share with you the lecture for today. I'm sure several of your other teachers are doing something similar, so take your time over the next day or two and just make sure that all of the assignments that I have given to you from Wednesday's class period today, including your current event, are completed for class on Tuesday. So today what we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at the lecture from chapter 2. I'm going to share my screen in just a second so that you guys can see the PowerPoint. And then after that, I actually have a video that I'm going to embed, but I'm also going to put the YouTube link up on It's Learning in case it's annoying to watch it via this format. You guys can link straight to that. In Tuesday's class, you guys are actually going to have a quiz on the material from chapter 2. So if you feel like, between the things that you did in your composition book, you guys have those 3 charts that you should have completed by now in your composition book. Today's lecture, if you need to go back through and reread chapter 2, because more than likely you haven't read it yet, if you want to go through and read chapter 2, that really should give you everything that you need for your quiz in class on Tuesday. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm not going to put the slides up on It's Learning. So if you guys need to pause and take notes, I would encourage you to do that. I'll go pretty quickly through the slides. So just make sure that you guys can pause if you need to. So give me just a sec. I'll share my screen. Okay, so chapter 2, Origins of American Government. So a lot of this, guys, is going to be reviewed for you from U.S. history. Again, this is all the stuff about the old dead guys. So some of it may be more helpful for you than others to write down. But when we take a look at the basic concepts of American government, most of what the Founding Fathers came up with was borrowed concepts. So there existed this idea, this need for an ordered social system, and that's what we call a government. We've talked in previous class periods about what those characteristics of a government are, not necessarily a democracy, but that there's people, there's land, there's not always popular sovereignty. Okay, that's what we have, where people ordain the government, but that there exists land and some structure and a people. This idea of limited government that we have in the United States means that the government shouldn't be all powerful. That's when you get into a dictatorship, an autocracy, an oligarchy. And so we have what's called a representative government that serves the will of the people. We give the government the permission to make decisions on our behalf. And this should look familiar to you from what you've completed in your composition book, where we look at where did these old English documents fall in line with what we have. And so we start with the Magna Carta in 1215, and the Magna Carta introduced people to things like trial by jury, due process. That meant that there were certain there's certain parameters surrounding a criminal procedure, and the idea of private property. And keep in mind, for English people, property was very hard to come by, and it honestly still is. Property is very expensive in England and really in Europe altogether, and so a lot of people rent, and if you own large amounts of property, it's a sign of wealth. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights added on to what the Magna Carta created, and that included the rights of no cruel punishment. Cruel or unusual punishment is the wording that we've used in the Constitution. No excessive bail or fines, and that always brings me pause. I'm like, who's to determine if it's excessive? $1 is excessive to me, if I'm the person that's being accused of a crime. The right to bear arms. And so I also told you guys last class period, when Americans are given something, Good luck taking that away. And so we look at even those controversial topics like abortion and gay marriage. Those are things that Americans have gotten used to. And so if the government tries to legislate that away, we know that there's going to be a battle. The right to petition, to go to your government and to request certain things. And then the Virginia Bill of Rights is also going to add a couple more ideas, plant a few more seeds for the Americans. That's no unreasonable searches and seizures. And yes, at school, on government property, you give up those rights. So that argument's not going to work. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. And again, you have those rights as long as they don't infringe upon the rights of other people. All right, the 13 colonies. America was established with 13 different types of colonies, whether they were royal, proprietary, or charter. So those royal colonies are defined as those ruled directly by the English monarchy, probably under the strictest control. The king granted land to people in North America, and then those formed proprietary colonies. And then the third type of colony is a charter colony, and those were mostly self-governed. Those were the most free to kind of do what they please without the infringement upon the king. All right, British colonial policies. Until the mid-1700s, colonies were allowed a great deal of freedom. And it's interesting, as the colonies became more successful and autonomous, that's when you're going to see the king go, hey, wait a second, I want in on the piece of that pie. And that is where things really went awry. And King George started imposing the new taxes because he saw the colonies as being very fruitful, as being something that could contribute greatly to the success of England. But unfortunately, there was a big separation, and it's called the Atlantic Ocean, and it's very difficult to control the depth and breadth of America, the colonies, when you're that far apart. So there started to be attempts at growing colonial unity. These early stages of growing colonial unity. In 1643, that's the first time we're going to see the New England Confederation join together for a common purpose. And that's going to be followed by the Albany Plan of Union. And I want you to think back to U.S. history, and you may have come across a political cartoon of a snake, and the snake was disjointed. And each of the sections of the snake represented different colonies. And that political cartoon was created by Ben Franklin. And his message with that was either we join together or we die. Just as the pieces of a snake, unless they're connected, don't create life for the snake, the colonies were going to function in much the same way. And it's a great analogy. I believe that political cartoon is also in your textbook in chapter 2. But Ben Franklin called together this group of delegates and said, let's come together and let's put our minds together. Now, they didn't come up with some big, crazy document. They didn't write the Declaration of Independence, but it did plant those seeds for early colonial unity. That's going to be followed by the Stamp Act Congress in response to the Stamp Act. The delegates prepared at the Stamp Act Congress a declaration of rights and grievances that were sent to King George. And it was kind of that offering of an olive branch. An olive branch is a symbol of peace. And it says, look, these are the things that you've done wrong. Let's make these things right. That cry of no taxation without representation was birthed at this point. And it basically said, look, the taxes might be fair, but how are we to know unless we actually have a voice within Parliament? So allow us to have representation. The king said, sorry about your luck. It's a bit of a deal breaker. So the Stamp Act Congress did not bring to fruition everything that the colonists had hoped. So that's going to lead to the Continental Congresses. That first Continental Congress is where the colonists sent the Declaration of Rights to King George III. And the colonists, or the delegates, urged each of the colonies to refuse to trade with Britain unless they're going to take away the taxes. A great word for taking away, to recall them, is to be repealed. They weren't going to take away those taxes, then the colonies may end up in rebellion. And that's going to lead to the Second Continental Congress in 1775, because the king was basically like, sorry guys, not happening. And so in 1775, each of the 13 colonies sent representatives to this Second Continental Congress gathering in Philadelphia. Philadelphia at that point in time was kind of that central hub. And the Second Continental Congress served as the first government of the United States from 1776 to 1781. And if you'll recall, that document that governed the United States of America to begin with was the Articles of Confederation. So, no surprise to you all, July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. And between 1776 and 1777, most of the states also adopted similar charters, similar constitutions, instead of charters. So, what were some of the common features of state constitutions? Popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, again, is the principle that government can exist with the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed. And then the idea of limited government, that the government didn't have all exclusive power over the people. Remember, they got rid of King George. They were not interested in going back there. Civil rights and liberties. And this always kind of gives me that, what does that exactly mean in the times of colonial, in the colonial time? Because here's the deal. It was basically white dudes, okay? And aside from that, women, African Americans, Native Americans did not have civil rights and civil liberties. So that's a very loosely used phrase during the colonial era. And separation of powers and checks and balances. And so the state constitutions had this, but it really wasn't until later that we're going to see the national government had that, because there weren't the three branches of government under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation establishes firm league of friendship, but it really didn't give a lot of power to a central government, and that's going to later become a weakness. So again, the Articles of Confederation established this firm league of friendships. They were given some basic powers under the legislature to declare war, deal with finance issues, settle disputes amongst states. And then in turn, the states had certain obligations that they needed to obey Congress, respect laws of other states. But most power was retained by each state. And so it was a federal system of government like we have today, but the balance of power had shifted, that now the states were supreme over the national government. And over time, they realized that there were weaknesses to this federal system of government, this firm league of friendship underneath the Articles of Confederation. And so representatives from Maryland and Virginia met at Mount Vernon, Virginia, 1785, to discuss trade issues. Mount Vernon, obviously, is where George Washington hung his hat in his home. And this meeting was so successful that the Virginia Assembly requested a meeting of all 13 states, which eventually became the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. A very secretive convention. It was a highly contentious convention, did not go super smoothly. There were disarguments. There were disagreements. There were conflicts. James Madison, who was the co-author of the Articles of Confederation, became known as the father of the Constitution because he actually penned the document, like Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was attended mostly by military leaders, governors, lawyers, people who were super, super smart during the colonial era, but some who did not attend. Patrick Henry said he smelt a rat and refused to attend. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were actually not selected as delegates by their states. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine were not in the country, and John Adams was also not in the country. And through this discussion, there's going to be emerge different plans, and the crash course video that you guys are going to watch after this this note-taking session is going to talk about these different plans in detail. But the idea of representation was debated by Virginia and New Jersey. So Virginia was a larger state, and they believed because they were larger both in landmass and people that they should have more representation in Congress. The New Jersey plan, proposed by a smaller state, said, you know what, every state should be equal regardless of our land mass. They proposed a unicameral, a one-house legislature, whereas Virginia proposed a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature. And Connecticut swooped in and said, hey, let's combine these ideas of both New Jersey and Virginia and come up with a bicameral Congress, and one segment would have equal representation for the states, and that emerged to be the Senate, and the other with representation that's proportionate to the state's populations, and that would be the House of Representatives. That's going to be coupled with a three-fifths compromise, dealing with that looming issue of slaves. And not every state had a large number of slaves. And so the three-fifths compromise said, you know what, we want to count for every 5 slaves, 3 of them is going to be counted. But they're going to be counted both for representation and taxation. So in that regard, the northern states wouldn't be slighted as much because the tax benefit would be there. So southern slave states, they counted their slaves for both taxation and representation. So what's the reaction? The framers were familiar with a lot of the writings that were adopted, specifically the writings of Locke and Rousseau. And they brought to the table a lot of the nuances of both the Articles of Confederation and what they had created via state constitutions. And so they were able to apply that to the writings that were included in the Constitution. Some loved it and some didn't. And so it was going to end up to be a pretty debatable topic amongst the states because the Constitution was not ratified by the Constitutional Convention. The document was then sent out to the states. And so Ben Franklin is quoted to say, "From such an assembly of fallible men, can a perfect production be expected? It astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does." And I really want you to think about that. His words ring pretty true. We've only amended the Constitution 27 times. 10 of those amendments were created at the birth of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And 2 of those subsequent amendments canceled each other out in the form of prohibition. So this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is going to ensue in the states. The Federalists thought that the Articles of Confederation were weak. They argued for the ratification of the Constitution. Anti-Federalists objected to the Constitution for many reasons, but most importantly because they feared a strong central government and the lack of a Bill of Rights. And we know the Constitution did get ratified. Delaware was the eager beaver there. With a 30-0 vote right away. And then I just want you guys to look at that for just a couple seconds, and then you'll see down there towards the bottom, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, those were the hotly contended debates. It's going to emerge in the creation of the Federalist Papers, a series of essays by the supporters of the Constitution, and those were going to be the arguments in favor of ratification. The Anti-Federalists created a similar set of papers there, not nearly as famous. So, and last but not least, inaugurating the new government, the new Congress met for the first time, March 4th, 1789, and it was at that first session that Congress decided and unanimously elected the president, the very first president, George Washington, and he was inaugurated on April 30th. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears to the crash course video. And the assignment that you guys have with this crash course video is as follows. First off, I'm going to tell you, this dude talks really fast. If you guys think that I talk fast, it's nothing in comparison to what this guy does. But what I want you guys to do is write down in your composition book 15 factual bullet point takeaways. 15. Okay, keep in mind that you can pause this at any time. You can go back and watch it. I'm going to post the YouTube link separately on It's Learning in case you don't want to watch it via this avenue anymore if the audio is muffled. I'm not sure what you're watching this on, but if you need to do that, feel free. But just know that those 15 bullet points need to be written in your composition books. And I will, again, check all of this completed work on Tuesday in class.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today we're going to talk about the single most important document in America, one that we'll be talking about a lot over the next few months. No, I'm not talking about O Magazine. It's the United States Constitution, and what we're really going to focus on is how it got made and how it became the foundation of our government. Those of you who watched the U.S. History series with John Green probably remember that the government set up by the Constitution is actually the second attempt at an American government. Also, as pointed out in the comments, you probably noticed that I am not John Green. The first American government, which was in place during the Revolutionary War and for almost 10 years afterwards, was the Articles of Confederation. Like many first attempts, the Articles government had some good ideas and it meant well, but it was poorly executed. Give it a break. It never did this before. So when delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles, they ended up scrapping the whole thing and creating a new constitution. It's probably not because they didn't know what revise meant. So the delegates from the various states each had their own agendas at the Constitutional Convention, and that made it difficult for them to agree on what the new government should look like. In order to hammer out a constitution, they had to do something you don't see very much in government these days: compromise. Oh, let's compromise. I'm sorry, Eagle, I didn't mean. Before we get into what those compromises were, it's kind of necessary to look at what was so bad about the Articles of Government in the first place. The main thing was it really couldn't govern. There was no executive branch or president and no judiciary to settle disputes. It was basically just a Congress where each state was equally represented and they all pretty much had veto power and could sink legislation they didn't like. All decisions were collected, which meant that very few decisions were actually made because it's really hard to get 13 people to agree on something that will be in the interest of all 13. I can barely agree with Stan on anything, right, Stan? He said wrong. Most important, the Articles government had no power to levy taxes, which meant that if it needed any money to do, well, anything, it had to ask for the money from the states, which were free to say, no, I don't think we'll be giving you any money today, or tomorrow, or ever. As I remember from my college years, and I don't remember much, living without money is awful. Without money, it's pretty much impossible for a government to do anything except buy ramen noodles. The Articles government was able to accomplish one notable thing, though. One of the big issues it had to deal with was Americans moving out west, which in the 1770s and 80s meant to places like Ohio and Indiana that weren't states yet. The government managed to set up rules for these settlements in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This set up a system for eventual statehood, but most importantly, it forbade slavery in these territories, which, as students of American history know, was kind of a big deal. You wouldn't know that if you're not a student of American history. You're a symbol of America. Bird. I'm not going to punch you. Other than that, though, the Articles government was a flop. And the very thing that made it so ineffective threatened to screw up any attempts at new government, too. This was the issue of competing interests between different states, more specifically the states with large populations and the smaller states. Basically, a state with a large population, like, say, Virginia, had different needs than a state with a small population like Delaware. More importantly, large states might stand to benefit more from any government spending. When the delegates decided to make a new Congress, these large population states wanted the number of representatives to that Congress to be proportional to the state's populations, which would mean that the larger states would have more representatives than the smaller ones. This idea, a large Congress made up of many delegates, was called the Virginia Plan, because it was put forward by the delegates from Wisconsin. Just kidding, Virginia. The delegates from small New Jersey put forward a plan that would have a Congress where each state would send an equal number of representatives. In other words, something that looked a lot like the Articles government. This New Jersey plan would prevent smaller states from being dominated by the larger states, and also ensure that the large states wouldn't be able to vote themselves a bigger share of government spending. These two opposing interests threatened to scuttle the whole new government thing until Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed the Great Compromise that gave us the bicameral legislature that we talked about in episode 2, and we've all come to know and love sometimes. So the Great Compromise meant that we would have a two-house legislature, but this wasn't the only issue related to how the seats in Congress would be apportioned. Membership in the House would be based on the state's population, but at the time there was an issue about how to count that population. The issue was slavery, more specifically, how to count slaves as part of the state's population. Let's go to the thought bubble. The states with large slave populations like South Carolina and Virginia had a pretty big interest in counting these slaves for the purposes of determining representation. And the states with few slaves didn't want them counted at all, because this would mean that the white non-slave people in those states with lots of slaves would effectively be better represented than the white non-slave people in the states with few slaves. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention solved this problem with another compromise that was decidedly less great. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution includes the following clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. If you're looking for the word slave, you won't find it. They're the ones described by the phrase 3/5 of all other persons. This is the notorious 3/5 compromise. What it means is that in order to determine how many representatives a state has, you count the number of free people in the state, including indentured servants, and add to that number 3/5 of the number of non-free persons, otherwise known as slaves. So in terms of counting, each slave was worth 3/5 of each free person. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Anyway, this meant that the states with large populations of slaves would be disproportionately represented in Congress, but not quite so badly that most northern states with small numbers of slaves wouldn't vote for the Constitution. What this also did was enshrine the idea that slaves, who were mostly black, were worth less than free people, who were mostly white, and it embedded slavery into the Constitution. So before this Constitution of Compromise could go into effect, it had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. So each state had a special convention where delegates could vote on whether or not to adopt the new Constitution. These conventions were more open to the public than the Constitutional Convention itself, and the ratification process is the reason why some people say the Constitution is based on the will of the people. But not everybody wanted the Constitution, and they needed convincing. This is where things get a little confusing. Did you want the Constitution? Did you? In 1787, public opinion about the Constitution was pretty evenly divided. Those who wanted the Constitution were called Federalists, largely because of the Federalist Papers, a series of articles written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They wrote the Federalist Papers to convince voters in New York to ratify the Constitution. And since New York did eventually ratify the document, I guess they were. But we should listen to both sides of the argument in the Clone Zone. So joining us in the Clone Zone today will be Federalist Clone and Anti-Federalist Clone. Let's hear from Federalist Clone first. Fetty? Can I call you Fetty?
No. The Federalists were the incredibly intelligent Americans who thought that a strong central government would benefit the country as a whole. They tended to come from cities, and often they represented commercial classes, especially wealthy people who had lent money to the government during the Revolution. They liked the new Constitution because they felt that a strong national government would pay its debts, and this was good for business. They also tended to want stronger ties with England, again, because England was a good trading partner. Given the raging success of the Articles government, it's pretty clear that the Federalists were right.
Okay, now let's hear from Anti-Federalist Clone. How do you respond, Auntie? I'm not your aunt. Sure, Federalists were right to believe in tyranny. Anti-Federalists were right to be skeptical of a large government that would trample on our individual liberties. They didn't want a big government that would tax them to death and possibly take away their slaves. In general, Anti-Federalists felt that states would be the best protectors of people's rights and liberties because, being smaller, they would be more responsive to people's needs. Okay, the Anti-Federalists published pamphlets and articles too, but we weren't quite as organized, so we didn't have a coherent set of Anti-Federalist papers to push on government students. Okay, you seem really mad about this. I am, but you eventually lost the debate. I did. Huzzah! How come he got to shoot first? I didn't know he was going to want to shoot. I'm sorry. Next time, you can have fireworks. So the Federalist position won out, and the Constitution was ratified, and that's the government that Americans have been living under ever since. Hooray! Because the Constitution was passed, we tend to think that everyone loved it, but it wasn't nearly as clear-cut as hindsight makes it appear. Eventually, the Federalists had to offer another compromise, promising a Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments. This isn't called one of the constitutional compromises because it happened outside of the convention, but it was yet another example of how different interests had to give a little in order to get a constitution passed. It's very important to remember that compromise, the idea of balancing interests and giving a little to get a lot, is embedded in the Constitution. While today it seems like a political dirty word, compromise is the basis of the American government itself. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Well, I'll compromise. See you in a week and a half. Let's face it, Stan's probably not going to get this done in time anyway. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from Vocal. Vocal supports nonprofits that use technology and media to advance social equity. Learn more about their mission.
All right, guys. So you're all set. Make sure that everything is completed. Composition book, those 3 charts that we started earlier this week, your 15 bullet points from the video that you just watched. that you guys are prepared for your quiz on Tuesday, that you've got your current event ready to be turned in, and I hope you guys enjoy your very much extended week. And feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks. Y'all have a great day.